After raising more than $13,000 for charity, Joey Politano has been elected the 2024 Chief Neoliberal Shill. Congratulations to Joey, who joins the podcast for a wide-ranging conversation after his election as Chief Shill. We talk about his experiences as one of the youngest full-time professional bloggers out there, his opinion on the state of the economy, the Vibe session, and what he wishes more journalists would understand about reporting on the economy. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoy the show, please make sure to go give us a like, a comment, a subscribe. All those things are helpful. If you really enjoy the podcast, please consider supporting us. You can do so at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast, or you can support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thank you so much for your support, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Joey Politano. Joey, welcome to the show.
Glad to be back.
And we should say, Joey has just recently been crowned the new Chief Shill of all the liberals for 2024. So I want to say again, congratulations, Joey, on your new title as Chief Shill. Do you have a speech prepared?
I have a speech. It is 400 pages, so you're going to have to give me a bit. But no, it is an honor, and it's very sweet to see how many people came out and voted for me, and especially how many people donated to Against Malaria in the last round, which I think has become my favorite part of the bill bracket. So honored to be selected. Happy to be reigning.
It's one of the best things we've done.
Yes.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, we run a very silly thing on Twitter every March that coincides with like the March Madness basketball tournament, and we call it the Neoliberal Shill Bracket. Maybe now it's the New Liberal Shill Bracket. But we crown a Chief Shill every year, and it's done through voting, and it's a lot of fun. This year, Joey won the contest. And one of the things we do is in the final round, rather than actually voting, just, whoever gets the most votes, we turn it into a donation contest. And you can donate to Against Malaria, which is a wonderful charity. And whichever candidate gets the most donations in their name wins. And the final round was not close.
Yeah. Which is very funny, especially compared to last year, where because I was in the finals last year too, and I was getting absolutely smoked by Matt Darling, who ended up winning. But the funny thing was, last year there was a lot of people who deliberately started donating to me to be like, I'm trying to make the competition closer. I'm trying to balance it out so there'll be more donations by evening the score.
It's a lot of fun. And then look on the one hand, this is a very dumb, silly thing. But on the other hand, I feel like it actually, it helps build the community. Like people enjoy it. People have fun with it. And, it gives people like a list of cool accounts to follow. And I don't know, like, despite it being dumb, I think it's nice.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's jump into the podcast, though. We've got the Joseph Politano kind of platform that every Chief Shill gets to define their reign by a few things. And I want to talk about your experience as kind of a blogger and essentially, a business owner at a pretty young age, because you're only 25 years old, right?
Yes. I turned 26 in August. I lose my health insurance this year.
Well, hopefully Apricotas is doing pretty well. But you are one of the younger Chief Shills we've ever had. And I'm curious, what your experience has been like as essentially a very young entrepreneur. And I guess maybe let's start with the beginning of the blog and Apricotas. Is this something that, you identified like, oh, there aren't enough people doing this kind of writing and I want to do that? Or is it more just, I'm going to start a blog and, this is just what I happen to like talking about?
Yeah, so I started the newsletter in basically mid 2021. And it was like for a variety of personal reasons. It was partly because I felt like I had something to say about econ that I wanted to like share with the world and wasn't getting the chance to. It was partly because I wanted to like hone and train the kind of skills that I wanted to have. Like if I was going to be talking about econ, I felt like the best way to do it was to actually get out there and start talking about it. And it was also partly a way to just say, okay, I'm trying explicitly to do this socially. I would like to, meet other people in this space. And it's still being, 2021, where we're, just leaving, just everybody just gotten vaccinated. So we're just exiting COVID kind of, where it was very important for me to still be like, have a presence online. And so I started writing the newsletter then, and it's very funny looking back at like the first few posts. Don't go read them. Don't do it. But they were like a little bit different, a lot more word heavy than the kind of stuff I do now. Because very quickly I realized that like, the actual like gap in the discourse, the gap in like the blogging, the blog sphere, was the kind of charts and data analysis they do. And so over time, the like newsletter went from being like Joey's thoughts on the economy first and Joey's like data analysis on the economy second, to the other way around, where I like start from the data and then work towards a conclusion.
That's really interesting because I guess, like, look, if you're trying to make a name for yourself as an analyst of something, right, of the economy, for instance, but you could talk about this for something else. If you're talking about like the entertainment industry or something like that, there's two ways to do it. Number one is to be kind of narrative driven. And there are some people who are very good at this. There are some people who are legitimately very, very, very smart and can produce great narrative accounts of what's going on in the economy. And you could call these hot takes if you want, but there's people who do this. But the thing is, it's so easy to do that like the market is flooded with that. And a second way to become like a respected pundit on the economy is just to produce facts. Your newsletter typically doesn't, produce a ton of like commentary in the classic sense, like op-ed page style commentary. But what you do better than almost anybody is just, well, here's an interesting thing people are talking about, like used cars. So here's 100 charts about used cars. Here's every actual factual detail about the used car market. And that is my value add, is like, I'm the one who actually knows how to go find, which parts are actually in shortage, or, which countries are shipping the most, or, whatever the case may be. Right.
Right. And I think there is a lot of value in that. The best advice I got when I was starting my newsletter was you have to do a job for your audience, quote unquote. And that's like a very abstract thought. The way I interpreted it was like, your audience should be receiving something valuable that they could not otherwise produce. And it doesn't have to be the only thing they receive. It doesn't mean you have to like depersonalize it, which I think is actually like a very bad idea, to like try to remove the writing that you're doing from the person doing it entirely. But it does mean that you have to like think very intentionally about why would people read what I write over, something else. The most successful people at Substack that I know, like kind of start out on a niche, and you very much like dig your way to like more general topics. And I've definitely
there's a phrase I've heard, like niche down to scale up or something like that.
Yes. That's too San Francisco for me to say. That's definitely something somebody in the Bay Area would say, and I just phrase it as start in a niche and become a generalist. But it's very good advice, especially because like content markets are oversaturated, and because media as an industry, like financial journalism, is not being a celebrity, but it is like a media industry, and in all media industries, there's like a very large superstar effect, the like largest returns go to the most popular people. And so you have to like, you have to carve out a spot for yourself when you're starting out and when you're not like already super popular.
It's interesting you mentioned the superstar effect, because I actually just wrote something about this on my Substack, which, I've kind of been observing some of the same things you do. But I think that, the superstar effect does exist, but it's not as strong as it used to be. The internet has really enabled a sort of like middle class of celebrity that I don't think necessarily existed before. There's like the statistic is that there's something like there's 300,000 YouTube channels that have more than 100,000 subscribers. Certainly not all of them are Mr. Beast, but if you've got 100,000 subscribers, you can potentially make it. You could potentially turn that into a job, or like you are not a world famous writer, but within your niche, you're pretty well known, and I think Apricotas is still growing. Last I checked. And so, I don't know. How do you think about like that middle class of content creation?
I do think it's real. So I think we've been having this argument basically for probably now 10 years as like the middle class of the internet or middle class of media kind of thing. I think sometimes the argument goes too far in the other direction, where people imagine that it's like easy to eat. Like saying the middle class of media makes it sound like this is something that doesn't require a lot of luck. And I don't think that's the case. Like, I'm very conscious of the fact that, if you were to like rank the econ substacks of the world, there's probably about 150 to 200 of them that are like in the space of like large popularity. If you're looking at like the top 5, those are making like, substantial, way above top 1% incomes. You jump down to like me at number 50, you're making like, okay, good white collar American job income. You jump down like another 50, you're already out into like people who cannot do this full time because it's not supporting them. And so like that wedge of like somebody who's making enough but not making an insane amount is kind of a tiny space to be, and can be a lot more precarious. But I do think there has been like the way I like to think about it is, you had like the mass culture era in the 20th century. You had that like fracturing in the 21st with like the internet and social media. And the result of that is like, it's easier than ever to be, niche celebrity. The joke about like niche internet micro celebrity is definitely true. Where like nobody's going to recognize me on the street, and yet I like make enough money from what I do to be able to support myself. Like, that's a very new phenomenon. I'm not sure if that's going to keep expanding, or if it's going to like, shrink towards the superstars in the future.
Yeah, I'll say a lot of this also depends on like what channel you're talking about. Like, YouTube is really easy to monetize, and it's probably the most like career friendly platform out there. Like, YouTube is just everybody. The playbook for YouTube is very clear, and you can monetize. And they're actually very friendly to creators. Whereas like, there's also something like hundreds of thousands of people who have 10,000 Twitter followers or more, but you can't monetize Twitter. Like, technically you can now that Elon Musk is there, but like Twitter monetization is pathetic, and nobody can make a career out of Twitter without actually referencing a YouTube channel or a Substack or something like that. So to some extent, this depends on like, where is your internet celebrity based?
Yes, and I will also say it's like what you do on the internet. I joke all the time that it's like, if I had ended up with an obsession around like food instead of economics, like I would never be able to do this. Like, there are food blogs that have, the kind of readership that I have that don't, have the kind of financial success, not a knock on them. It's just like the I had the great fortune of being interested in something that who plausibly are trying to make money are also interested in. And so there is like definitely, that aspect to it too, depending on who your target market is, like what your niche is, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, so let's actually get into some of the economics then, because we're probably going to keep talking about Substack and blogging for a while. But one of the big discourses of the last year in politics has been, is the economy actually good or not? And people fight about this. Will Stancil became the whole ass celebrity and might end up in the state legislature because of it. People are down on the economy, or at least they were down on the economy last year. The public is very, very unhappy about it. And yet all of the economic signs seem to be really good. And people argue about, like, is it all about the media? Is it about inflation? People try to explain it. And now that the consumer sentiment seems to be going back up, people are trying to explain, well, what changed? Do you have thoughts? Do you have like a firm opinion on, the state of the economy? Was it actually good? And why did people, why were they so mad about it? Is vibe session a real thing?
Yeah, I think it was a very, it was wild for how long that discourse existed, how long it like survived. Like the lifespan of a Twitter discourse is usually not that long. And for how like, high stakes and to some extent like vitriolic it was. I think it's very funny that like over the last, most people were anchoring to the University of Michigan consumer survey. That's like the default consumer survey in the US, even though I don't think it's the best one. But that survey's been like a straight line up for 4 or 5 months now. So people have stopped talking about the vibe session because the vibes have improved. There's still a gap. If you were still, people were talking about a core part of this was like, if you estimate, you take inflation and job growth and GDP growth and consumer spending and yada, 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 and plug it into a model, that model should suggest that expectations would be higher. We haven't like perfectly converged where the model, modeled consumers are agreeing with like actual consumers, but it's close enough that it's no longer like this massive, interesting discourse. And I think it's also funny that like we, people across the pond had a very similar thing where like people in the UK and in France and Germany, like consumer sentiment was really bad in those countries. The difference being that like the line chart mafia also thought that the economy was bad in those countries. So you were like agreeing.
Yeah, I think I've heard Stancil talk about this as well, that like the vibes are so bad everywhere else in the world that it's infecting American perceptions, I guess.
I think that's maybe a small part of it. It is very funny when you see someone like in the UK talking about their economy being bad, and then it's getting retweeted by a bunch of Americans who think it's about them.
The other thing is that you'll see a lot, and this actually happens way more than it should, is somebody will be like, Joe Biden has done the blah, 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 and we can't even live anymore, and the blah, 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 and everything is blah, blah, blah. And you'll be like, this person is actually like French or like Canadian or something. And you're, what the heck? What do you mean we? What are you talking about,
I saw a great this was like just a TikTok that came up yesterday, and I'm not trying to extrapolate based on one TikTok. This is not my argument. I'm just making a joke. But it was like a graph of like who's buying homes. It was like first time home buyers, the line was going down, and then it was like investors and second time buyers, the lines were going up. You know what I mean? And then all the comments were like, "This is Joe Biden's Build Back Better in action. This is Bidenomics." And then like nobody noticed that it was the graph was from Canada. It had nothing to do with the US.
Man, it's, you think, what's the old saying? Like nobody ever went broke, underestimating or underestimating the intelligence of the general public, something like that. I don't know. I feel like that's proven correct on Twitter every day.
It's a PT Barnum.
But yeah, no, it is interesting because it seemed like a discourse that, was tailor-made for you specifically, because it's a bunch of people arguing over the interpretation of graphs, basically, that like, oh, you think the economy is good? Well, what about this? Okay, well, here's a graph for that. Oh, well, what about this other thing? Okay, well, here's a graph for that. Like that's your corner, right?
Yeah. And I think the more I engaged with the Vibe Session discourse online, the more I felt like the conclusions were being walked backwards and not forwards. You know what I mean? Like you'd have these arguments about, oh, the reason why, I'm just throwing out a hypothetical argument that I saw a lot. Like, okay, people are mad about the economy. Then people say, well, what is the justification for them being mad about the economy? And then they pull out a chart and they would say, I think this is the answer, or a large component of the answer. And then you'd have to be like, that doesn't make any sense, because this chart was doing the same thing in 2019 and people were not mad. The example that I remember was like, people were talking about, oh, the reason why vibes are so low is because real wage growth is very slow. And it's true that like on a year-to-year basis, you're not going to have in most times like 5% real wage growth. You're going to at max get like 3% real wage growth, which is not, if you just look at a 3% increase on its own, it's not life-changing. But it was a very funny discourse to me, because it's like, well, 3% is better than, we were at 2.5%, say, in 2023, that the vibes were still awful. And it's like 2.5% was much better than in most of the 2010s when vibes were much better.
Yeah, there was a lot of analysis that didn't take into account any other period in history, right? Like you can try to explain why people are unhappy, but you have to compare it to previous times. And if, this number was actually way worse in 2012, but people were happier, then there's a mystery there.
Right. You see a ton of arguments that were also like, the reason why people are unhappy is because the U.S. healthcare system sucks, or like the housing market is too expensive, or we don't have the same sort of like work-life balance that the Europeans have. And I'm like, okay, but that was also true in 2019, and people said that the economy was like the best it's been in 50 years since 2019.
Yeah.
So like you gotta come up with an explanation here. I do think it is. I also, because of that, I also don't believe a lot of the like media first explanations, the like Stancelite hypothesis, the like very strong Stancelite hypothesis, let me say, is like the reason the vibes are bad is because people are consuming a lot of negative media about the economy and internalizing it. And then they're also internalizing themselves as an exception. You see those charts that are like 70% of people think that they're doing okay. 20% of people say that the economy in general is doing okay. It's like, well, that, can't all both be true.
Yeah. I mean, I come down on kind of, look, it's multi-causal. There's not going to be like one smoking gun that explains it. But I'm friendly to the Stancil hypothesis. I really do think that like reporting and the general vibes, like that's a real thing that we can influence in some way. And I think that's part of it. I do think part of it just has to be inflation, like inflation, but lagged. People, I think we all forgot because it's been so long since the 1970s or whatever, but people really fucking hate inflation. They really, really hate it. And that was a lesson that we needed to learn again, maybe. But I think it's some combination of those two things. And, maybe you can talk about like people were shocked by like getting a bunch of stuff in 2020. And then like it was kind of the support was taken away. You can talk about stuff like that. You can talk about like some of it is just negative polarization. I think like Democrats always dislike Republicans and Republicans always dislike Democrats, but kind of like there's an asymmetry to that where Republicans will pretty much always say everything is crap under a Democratic president, and then some portion of the Democratic Party will also say things are crap because their brand of progressivism is based on the world is on fire at all times or whatever. I don't know. I kind of jumble all those things up together in my head, and I get some version of like why Vibe Session is happening.
Yeah, I think the main tough thing is like you can't. I don't think it's monocausal. I think also like you can look at some of the theories and say, okay, well, this is probably doing some work. One of my favorite like charts from U Michigan, they ask people like, have you heard good or bad news about the economy? And then they ask specifically like, have you heard good or bad news about employment, about inflation, about whatever? And the good or bad news about employment one was a really wild chart because even in the periods that like the US was adding hundreds of thousands of jobs per month, people were reporting that they were hearing bad news about employment. You're like that one. You're just chalking that one up to the media narrative not matching reality. I think there's a lot of I think there's demand. I think when people experience a lot of inflation, I think you're right that that's like the predominant driver. And if you're trying to connect this to like other countries, that why do the vibes so bad like everywhere? A lot of the answer just comes down to like prices rose really quickly everywhere. But I think it's also like people see inflation as a sign that other things are going like horribly wrong in the economy. You see the prices of things going up, and then you presume like there has to be this, negative supply shock. There has to be this like, catastrophic loss in output. People must be losing their jobs because inflation is such a strong negative signal, and it induces people to then like, they feel bad about inflation, and then they want to consume more negative like media that confirms their priors. And now you're looking at like Amazon laid off 1,500 workers last month, kind of news stories that are not representative of the actual like overall economic trend.
So that gets into something that I wanted to ask you. This is actually a great segue, which is, as someone who essentially is an economics reporter, and we can talk about the difference between journalism and blogging and newsletters and reporting, and all those words are kind of related, but sometimes different. But like for now, let's just jumble them all together. You do economic reporting of a type, and so does a lot of the rest of the media, the financial media, the mainstream media. What's your opinion on kind of the state of economic reporting, especially within like big mainstream outlets? Like, are there things that you think they get right and wrong? Are there things that frustrate you in the broader journalism industry about how people discuss the economy?
It's obviously been like a very tough time for media as like a business. The benefit of like financial media, econ media, is that it can like survive on a much wealthier base of consumers than like your average New York Times article. That leads to some like bad incentives, but it also has like kept it afloat. I think the thing I miss the most about like the 2010s era of journalism is you had a ton of publications that really thought like data journalism was the future. And I feel like that has been like pared back as places have gotten as business has gotten tougher.
Yeah, I will also say that I'm just going to break in real quick and say some of the places that did data journalism have just kind of degraded in their commitment to that or their quality. And I won't be shy about it. I'll specifically call out like Vox here, which has just kind of gone downhill from the glory days of, when Ezra Klein and Lauren Bell and Matt Iglesias were all there. Vox is not what they used to be, and I think some of it is also just publications declining.
Yeah, but there's a ton of, in my mind, incentive. One, to like create argument from anecdote. In a lot of places, and I joke a lot. We talked very early on about a lot of the stuff I do is just sort of data presentation. And so I joke a ton about like argument defeated by summary statistics. By which I mean like you'll read articles that are econ framed that are just like not descriptive of the actual reality of what is going on if you look at like the basic summary statistics.
Is this like one of those articles, just to make sure I'm following you, is this like one of those things that's like, as, the cost of healthcare rises, Gen Z wonders if they can keep up, and it will have like a story about one or maybe two, profiled Gen Z people, and it's like, oh, they're struggling, they can't afford this, they wonder where their future is going to be. And then you're saying, yeah, but look at a summary statistic of just like, what is the average wealth of a Gen Z? And it's doing great.
Right. But I mean, even and this is in like 100 different ways where you talk about like, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, there's some recent articles. There's like, oh, kids these days don't do enough homework in college. And then you actually look and it's like the amount of self-reported time spent doing homework is up 50% over the last 20 years. You look at like, there's an article, I'm trying to remember who published it, probably best that I don't, about like people leaving Florida. And I'm like, Florida.
Oh, I remember that.
A big state.
I do like, remember that.
State. There's millions of people. Of course, somebody's going to leave every year. Like the dominant trend.
I remember because Florida is very obviously gaining in population. Like that's so easy to look up.
Yes.
And if the story was, look, I'm sure there are some people who got mad at DeSantis that he's doing things that I don't agree with either. But like the narrative that DeSantis is causing like depopulation from Florida, which is obviously what they wanted you to think, that's not true.
Right. And it was such a weird article because it kind of acknowledged this idea that like, oh yeah, if you look at the numbers, like Florida, people obviously move to Florida all the time. That's been like a trend for the last 30 years of American history. But then it's like, let me pull out, these are the people who are leaving Florida. It's like, well, it's a state of tens of millions of people. Of course, there's going to be some people moving in and some people moving out every year. I don't know what to tell you. I think of also my least favorite genre is the like word crafting articles. These are like LinkedIn fodder that's like Gen Z is quiet working. They're loud quitting. They're silent skilling. They're like all of this stuff.
Laying flat. Yeah.
Right. No. And the desire to like have a narrative about the economy, and then it's like completely divorced from what's actually going on. I'll say the most frustrating example.
Joey, they're lazy maxing.
They're lazy.
They're rest pilled. They're in their sleep era. Yeah, their sleepy era. Like that's all the things too. Is if you ever see anything that's pilled or era or max or core, they're sleepy core. I don't know. Like there's 100 ways to say this, but it's all very like. And I say this as a 37-year-old. It's like a 37-year-old journalism writer somewhere who wants a 23-year-old to think she's cool. That's what it is.
Right. And the most frustrating narrative, this is now a little bit out of date as like an economic phenomenon that's dissipated a lot. But like the narratives around the Great Resignation were so bonkers to me. You had all these articles being like, people are, here's the graph of the number of people quitting their job. Americans are like, they're quitting their job because they're lazy. They want to like, they're quitting the job because they want to be self-employed. They're quitting a job because they're tired of like the 9-to-5 grind, blah, 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 blah. And then I remember writing an article when this was happening. And I was like, the number one reason that people quit their job, it's like 95% of quits are people who are going and taking a different job. They found a better job. So they're leaving, they're quitting the job they currently have. And that's a good thing. But it's just such a weird, like...
Why do you think this happens? Like, if we're talking about, I guess there's two things here. The desire to impose some kind of narrative on something that may not be true, and we're just going to back it up with like, we talk to one person, and that's our narrative, is like, this is happening to Derek, and Derek's story is very sad, and therefore it's a national trend. Like, what like structural part of the journalism industry is causing this to happen? Because as you've said, this kind of story is everywhere.
Yeah, I think the first part of it is that like people, in regardless of the actual type of article, all journalism is to some degree like storytelling and narrative. And I'm like conscious of that in the way I write, and I think people, need to be conscious of that in the way that they consume. And people, when you've already accepted that there's going to be some level of narrative, people like have an incentive to pick this like grand overarching theory of everything kind of narrative to make things more important. I think the second part is that there's like a desire to back up things you say with facts, but not in a way where you're looking at facts and then crafting the like things that you're saying. It's like you hear this, you have this narrative, this like grand theory that develops, and then you back up one step and say, let me dig out, the facts to support this.
This is the famous light post argument, right? They use facts the way a drunk uses a light post, not for illumination, but for support.
I've never heard that phrase before. That's cool. That's a good turn of phrase.
Oh, it's my favorite, and it's so true because I get to portray people that I don't like as slovenly drunks. So that's also fun. But no, really, like you're saying,
I've drawn myself as the Chad, and just you as the slovenly drunk.
Yeah, the big square chinned. I don't know. But like people do this. They decide what they want to say, and then they'll go pick facts. And sometimes you can even see this with research. It's not enough to be like, oh, well, this person cited a research paper, because look, if you start from the conclusion that I don't know, that the minimum wage kills jobs, you can go find a dozen different research papers to prove your point. If you start from the conclusion that the minimum wage does not kill jobs, you can find a lot of papers that say, like, it's really easy in the internet age to just pick whatever evidence you want, I feel like.
Yeah. And I think the other part of this is there's like a game of telephone that happens in media. You know what I mean? Like media people consume media more than almost any other person by virtue of it being their job. And so sometimes you have like a narrative starts and then it just becomes like a runaway snowball where people see like the first article and then they roll from there, going forward. A great example I'm thinking of it, this is a bit of a crude a crude thing to talk about, but like you remember in the like mid 2000s or in the mid 2010s, there was all that narrative about like the like young men not having sex, like specifically not young people, which is like there's a good amount of evidence that like young people have less sex than normal, like young men specifically.
And probably driven by like the incel, the rise of incel as a category.
Right. You had all those articles that were like the rise of incel, and then you had all the millions of hot takes like built around this premise. And then like if you dig, further, if there were a lot more polls and surveys done and like more of the high quality ones, it's like, well, the drop in intercourse is like pretty even between men and women. And so suddenly it's like, okay, you had this entire genre of discourse that was founded on, not in the sense of like a malicious lie, but it was founded on like a quirk of data that then like snowballed into its own beast before you could stop it. And I'm sure that there's a ton of people that still like believe, that narrative.
So if we get all the journalists moving away from narrative and we actually manage to convince all of them all at once to do better versions of what they're doing now, what do you think is kind of undercovered in economic journalism, financial journalism? What's an area that, and obviously like this is stuff you care about because like you look at this and you'll decide what to cover yourself, but What do you think we should be paying more attention to in the media and in our economics coverage?
So I will say, as a general trend, one of the things that I'm like most saddened by is that there is a ton of resources about like state and local economies that go like completely underutilized. And I pin a lot of this on like, I don't want to say like the death of local journalism, because there's still a lot of like good local journalism out there, but it's like the constraints on local journalism are so much tougher. And so I wish so often that you see these articles about like, you know, blah, 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 tech workers are doing this in Austin, or they're all moving to Boise, or like the Minneapolis economy is falling apart. And you're like, I wish that people would more contextualize their like local economies in a ton of ways, especially like in news reporting.
Yeah, I agree there. I think the problem there is just the demand side, in that we can talk a lot about the death of local journalism, but it ultimately comes down to the fact that people, for the most part, don't care to read it. And then it's sad, but the local newspapers are dying because people don't give a shit about them, like in the end.
Yeah. And I think that's like I mean, it's a problem for like all media. There's that joke about like everybody thinks like media is important, but nobody's willing to pay for it.
Yeah, if you're listening to this, go get a subscription to your local paper. It's probably dirt cheap, to get, unless you're like in New York and your local paper is the New York Times. If you're in some mid-sized American city, it is probably dirt cheap to get a year-round subscription to your city's local paper. You should go do it.
And I think it's also like a good community building tool. People are like understandably very concerned about whatever national dynamics that like do affect you, but like whatever regional local dynamics are currently happening are almost certainly going to have a much larger impact on your day-to-day life than whatever's going on in Washington. Not to say don't pay attention to Washington, but saying like do pay attention to whatever's going on in your city or town.
Yeah. And this gets into the like Eitan Hersh, like politics is for power argument about like political hobbyism, where people like to follow politics, but for most people, following politics means following national politics in the same way they would follow a sports team, or that they would stand for a pop star. Like it's a tribal thing, and you can cheer the good guys and you can boo, hiss the bad guys, but they don't actually do anything. Whereas local politics is a lot more like to really follow local politics is to get involved with it. And that requires you to do things, and doing things is scary sometimes.
But I will say, like, a lot of the in a more broad sense, I found myself like increasingly consuming information that's put out by like think tanks and nonprofits and other like academics, researchers. Like obviously my job is like very econ related to like the regional Federal Reserve banks. But like those groups have more time, more space to be able to take these like deeper dive looks at what's going on nationally and locally in a much more data-driven way that I feel like a lot of publications outside of like the New York Times, to a lesser extent, like the Washington Post and the LA Times, are like able to do. And I think that stuff is like incredibly valuable. And I wish we could get to like, I think a lot about, obviously I've self-selected for like a very niche kind of audience that already knows what like how GDP is calculated and what the difference between non-farm payrolls and the employment level are. But I do think also a part of media that's a part of the Substack model I really like, that I wish more of media could adopt, is that like direct one-on-one connection, in the way that it feels like I intentionally want it to feel like every piece that I write is building on the body of work that I've written previously. And it's not dependent on it. It's not load bearing. It's not like you have to read parts 1 through 4 to understand part 5, kind of thing. But I want people who have engaged previously, who have learned something and then carried it over into the next article. One of the big things I think is a problem with the social media era of journalism is like each individual article comes in your social media feed completely divorced of like context, nuance, like who is the author you don't know, maybe like what is this paper you might not know. And so having that like direct relationship, regardless of like topic, I think actually does help out a lot. And I think that's why a lot of like publications are like becoming more newsletter oriented, if that makes sense. Like they're choosing that as a presentation and delivery mechanism because I think it does genuinely help.
So I've got a pitch for you in terms of this whole idea of like, what do we wish the media did more of? What do we wish we saw more of in economic financial reporting? And I wish that this happened more in the broader media. But since you're the one here, I'm going to yell at you and say, why don't you do more of this? Because you're in front of me. So, and all the other ones are not here yet. But so one thing that I wish I saw more of, and this gets a little bit into politics, it's not entirely political, but it's not entirely non-political, is reporting on, more seriously, I guess, on Trump's economic ideas specifically. Because one of the things I find frustrating is that we talk so much and there's so much coverage of Trump. And it's usually like, what's the latest outrageous thing that Trump has said, or Trump's trial is starting. And look, he fell asleep during the trial. And that's very funny. And, Trump is getting sued by blah, blah. Like, it's all just scandal after scandal after scandal. And all the scandals become kind of this wall of white noise. And I feel like it's very undercovered that Trump, for instance, wants to put a 10% tax, a tariff on everything that's imported to America. And like, what industries would that disrupt? What would the actual impact of that be? Like, can we make some guesses as to how much that would raise the consumer price index? Can we make some guesses as to which industries would be the most hit? Like, that's the kind of thing that I think would be really valuable, is to talk just nuts and bolts, like factually, what is Trump proposing in the economy? And is it good or bad? Because, I have a point of view. I tend to think it's pretty damn bad. But it kind of frustrates me that is just not talked about very much.
Yeah, it is very depressing how much like the issue space has kind of declined over the years. Especially, I think people talk maybe too much about like post-material politics kind of thing. But like, because we have seen people react very quickly to like changes in their economic situation and how they interpret, the president and Congress and yada yada. But I do think that it's like these issues just don't get brought up. And it's a super weird thing to me as someone who watches politics too, that like no one, it's super hard because you look at, I think I made a tweet about this like a week ago or something, but it was like, you look at the polling on those ideas, like put a 10% tariff on everything. Trump also was like, put a 60% tariff on China. And they've called for some level of like escalating retaliatory tariffs. Like if the European Union put another tariff on us, we put one on them, and yeah, great. Like it would go back and forth forever. But like the actual, mechanical results of that kind of action would be like so hideously unpopular, it's almost not even funny. And yet, like the mechanism, the like idea pulls at like plus, 20, plus 30 or something. And I think that is partially like a failure of econ communication. And one that I'm not sure how much you should try to fix and say, oh, Donald Trump is actually, supports this idea I'm talking more from a political than a media perspective, but like from a political perspective, I'm not sure how much you say Donald Trump supports this idea that is very bad, but enjoys like widespread support among the American public versus find an idea that go focus on the ideas that have like very poor support among the American public, regardless of how quote unquote good they would be for the economy, and hammer there.
Yeah, I agree with that in terms of, I would love to see an Apricotas explainer of like, here's what a 10% tariff on all goods would do, or here's what a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods would do. Here's the sectors that would be impacted and a rough estimate of what prices might, blah, blah, blah. I would love that. But if you wanted something that's more like, I don't know, I'm trying to think like Trump plans to cut Medicare, that's one that is politically toxic, but that he would probably try to do if he was in office. Like, I wish we had more concrete coverage of like the stuff he wants to do that is actually bad. That's not just January 6th or, his mini scandals and all those they matter. But I wish we would talk about the material stuff too.
Yeah.
We're coming up on time, so I have just a couple more questions, but one of the things I wanted to ask you about in your, role as new chief shill, and therefore you are basically like king of the nerds, king of the online liberal wonks, basically. To me, it kind of seems like there's this odd phenomenon where, if you exist in kind of the wonk nerdy space of people who are like nerds about policy online, that really seems dominated by neoliberals or new liberals or just liberals. I don't know how you want to, whichever phrase you want to use. And it's certainly not every wonk. It's certainly not every guy or gal who knows policy really well and is like numerically literate is a neoliberal. But it sure seems like a disproportionate amount of them are. And so, as new chief shill, do you have any thoughts about like why that is?
When I think about modern American politics and kind of like modern global politics, I tend to think, you have like the left right scale. I love people love to do like compass of like left right, authoritarian, libertarian. But I think the more like defining features now are like left, right. Then are you like pro institution, anti-institution, or if you wanted to phrase it as like high trust, low trust,
maybe populist versus technocrat, maybe
populist versus technocrat, yeah, exactly. And then you also have like a pragmatist versus ideologue kind of contrast. And if you go into like the kind of jobs that are think tanky, like part of the DC think tank industrial complex, it ends up being a lot of people who are, technocrat, liberal, pragmatist. And when you've already selected for that series of traits, you end up with like people who are in our broader space. I think that there's like the amount of people who are in like DC think tanks who would self ID as like a quote unquote like new liberal is probably not that high, but the number of people who are like, you know what I mean, they exist in that like idea space is actually pretty high. And I think it's like a genuinely like a very good advantage that helps like counteract a lot of disadvantages that come from being in that kind of political space. And so I'm like not surprised by it. I don't know if it's like most people are, but I'm not.
And I think one of the challenges that we face, like the Center for New Liberalism, is that what we're trying to do is kind of give these people a flag to rally around. Because, I think you're right that there's a lot of people who are in our idea space and they agree with us on a lot of stuff. But traditionally, there's never been kind of a name for them. in the same way that there's a name for the left, and the left is organized and progressive, and you've all the way to the DSA, or like the right, the Republican right, the conservative right is very well organized, kind of in that center left-ish kind of just technocratic, wonky space. There's never been a name. You're just like a guy or a girl who, knows some policy really well. And I think our job to some extent is to give them a flag to rally around so they can all group together and actually have some degree of identity, and having a collective identity gives you power and influence in some ways. And that's part of what we're trying to do to some extent.
Yeah, and I think that's a good service, and it helps a lot to be more organized and present in people's life. I've gotten a lot of this is maybe less replicable, but like obviously I've gotten a lot of an absolute ton of value out of building like a community online of like-minded people. That's not obviously everyone can't do exactly the same things that I've done. That was maybe poorly phrased. I don't know how I'm trying to say this here. I've gotten a ton of value out of having a community online, and being able to like it helps a ton in trying to do the kind of work that I do, but also just trying to like exist as myself in DC. And I think that was something that was like missing from my life, my career before I started doing this, and especially during the pandemic. And so I'm very grateful for it now.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we are about to come up on time. So I'll ask you the traditional final question that we ask everybody on this podcast. And that is, what should people do if they want to learn more? Now, I will be the first one to recommend Apricotas. The website is apricotas.io. It's spelled what? Apricatis. Is that Apricotas?
Apricitas.
Okay, there we go. We'll link it in the show notes so that you can just click. But you go subscribe to Joey's blog. It's great data journalism, economic reporting. But other than your own blog, if people are interested in the state of the economy, if they're interested in kind of some of the stuff we've been talking about, what would you recommend they follow?
That is a good question. And any list that I will like give is going to be like super incomplete. So I will like stick to a couple people. These are the people that I like recommend in my Substack. Matt Klein at The Overshoot is really great, and he does independent, like very high-minded macro journalism, kind of focused on international trade and monetary policy stuff. If you read what I write and really like it and wish there was more, he's the person I would recommend. There's also Kyla Scanlon, who's like a great friend of mine, who she does like every kind of social media imaginable. She has like a podcast, and she's on TikTok, and she's on Twitter, and she has a newsletter, and I think she has like a book coming out all about so she's full court press, everything about the US economy. If you know Binary Bits, Tim Lee on Twitter and his newsletter Understanding AI is like the best resource I found for people who are trying to follow AI, which is obviously very important, but trying to do so in a way that's targeted at non-experts, let's say. And then Aziz Sundarji, who writes Home Economics, which, if you could not guess, is like a very, very housing-focused newsletter. He's one of very, very few people on this planet who I am jealous of his graphs and how good they look. So that's before. And like I said, that is by no means comprehensive list. And there's a ton of people that I have left out here, but that's the short list.
All right. Well, I want to be one of the first to wish you a very strong and prosperous reign as Chief Shill for 2024. We're glad to have you as part of the tribe, and want to thank you one more time for coming on the show. Joseph Politano, everyone.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.